Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 19th of September 2023. Before we go to the front line, and there's not been a huge amount of change to the front line, there's a lot of bandwidth being strangled by the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict that seemed to have flared up today, but there doesn't seem to be too much to add to what I told you this morning, just a few nuggets here and there, and that seems to have been the case for the last few days. I just want to go through the equipment losses that Andrew Perpetua, one of the mappers I use, he tots these up on a daily basis. And again, we can see hadn't got this out by the time I did my news piece this morning, but you can see that there's a 3-to-1, maybe even 4-to-1, 3 or 4-to-1 ratio of Russian losses to Ukrainian losses. Let's just have a quick look at what these are. The Russians seem to have lost a fair amount of surveillance and comms equipment, but a lot of civilian vehicles and military trucks. This shows that A, the Ukrainians are really hammering their logistics, Russian logistics, but B, as I've said before, the Russians are relying on civilian vehicles because they are, I presume, running out of military vehicles themselves. They started a war with very few military trucks compared to what their needs were. I think the figures were something like 4,000 military trucks, where the US would have 100,000 equivalent to do the same job, because the Russians rely so much on railways. But of course, particularly at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians took out a lot of the railway capabilities and sort of railway lines and bridges and whatnot coming into the country. So they're forced to use trucks. And as a result, they were ill prepared, and that was partly why they struggled at the beginning quite a bit. But anyway, now they're having to use civilian vehicles because they're running low on those military trucks, one presumes. Now, when we look at what the Ukrainians have lost, it's most of their equipment, it seems to have been lost in, and I presume that's a single airstrike. Now, I don't know anything about that. I might have to ask Andrew Perpetua about that, but that is be a big blow, losing all of that in one fell swoop. Yeah, I presume that would be a logistics node being hit by the Russians. It's not something we hear about too commonly, but it does happen. So that would be a real shame for the Ukrainians. They've lost a recovery vehicle as well, and a piece of surveillance comms. But basically, in terms of numbers, the Russians still losing considerably more than the Ukrainians here. Right, to go to the front line, the northeast sector, this axis, going from Kupiansk to Svatovo to Crimea. The ISW, Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, says Yevlash, spokesperson for the Ukrainians, stated that Russian forces have slowed their offensive activity in the Kupiansk direction. Anna Malia stated, although she's no longer in position, that Russian forces conducted no assault operations near Crimea and continued to regroup in the area. And the Ukrainian main military intelligence directorate, Budanov, stated that Russian forces deployed elements of newly created 25th Combined Arms Army to the Kupiansk-Svatovo-Crimea line with 80% of its planned manpower and only 50% of the necessary equipment. And that supports the ISW's assessment that the 25th CAA is likely combat ineffective due to its rushed deployment. The idea that here is that the Russians are producing new units, putting them together, possibly from mobilized troops back in Russia, training them out really quickly and throwing them onto the front line before they are properly equipped and ready to be deployed, and at the same time moving some of the more experienced elements from this area down to places like Zaporizhzhia and Robotyne, so on and so forth. Right, when we talk about activity around here, we can go to Novorifiivka. Here, Suryat map's a pro-Russian map, and if you don't know what my lines mean, please pause the video now and check out the map legend there. But yeah, Suryat map's a pro-Russian mapper, suggests that the Ukrainians have made gains. That's kind of catching up with what Andrew Perpetua said previously. As I said this morning, you can have all three mappers say on different days, and that, for example, the Ukrainians. So Andrew Perpetua yesterday said Ukrainians made some gains in Novorifiivka. Day after, Suryat map says that, and then maybe the day after that, Deep State map says so. But it doesn't signify that the Ukrainians have made 3 days of advances. It's one small advance that the mappers communicate on different days as they're catching up with each other or seeing bits of evidence they haven't previously seen. So don't think that there's consecutive days of advance necessarily. Right, in this general area, in the Ryarodka down to Novoriivka sector, there is a small village, Novorifiivka, that we talk about quite a lot just here. There's been, over the last few weeks, some really heavy fighting there. The Russians have tried a number of counter attacks in that area, and they have lost an awful lot of equipment. Now, I don't know if this is equipment that's just been lost in the last 24, 36 hours or so, but there is this footage going around today. Some of it hasn't been counted before, so I think some of it is recent. OSINT Technical says it appears that Ukrainian forces were able to stop a pair of Russian armoured pushes towards Novoriifka in Luhansk in the last few weeks, inflicting heavy casualties. Seen here, destroyed T-90M, 3 T-72B3s, a BMP-3 and a pair of BMP-2s join the earlier seen losses. So I think there's newly seen losses, but I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure anyone particularly knows exactly when these was kind of destroyed. There's another BMP-3, BMP-2s destroyed closer to the town next to the destroyed T-90A, and T-72B hit sometime in late August or very early September for some of that equipment. Large mass of destroyed Russian armor was hit further from the town. Okay, so this is the location that we are talking about here, but I can't say that this has definitely happened, as I say, in the last 36 hours, but also some of it may have been lost then. I think Ukraine Weapons Tracker is talking about some of it being new. But anyway, or newly seen. So that is where that is, and that is behind the lines of where the Russians are supposedly at, and that would indicate that would have been part of an earlier attack, at least for that geolocation there. OSINT Technical, the large mass of destroyed armor. So that's not to say all of what you've just seen in those pictures was from that point, but yeah, in this general area, the Russians have lost a lot of equipment. If you remember a few weeks ago, I was saying that I think they lost 6 tanks in one day, in one attack out on one of those days. So yeah, it's just starting to see a lot of the evidence for that. Anyway, coming down, we come to Crimea and pass there on the way to Bakhmut. And we'll see what the ISW has to say at that before looking at other sources. So back to my map, we have, before we go to the ISW, just a minor rejig or maybe Ukrainian gains, pushing back down this railway track towards Bilorivka, where the Russians have attacked up there previously. They kind of treat it like a road. Railways aren't obviously operational so close to the front line, so they're kind of useful for moving vehicles. The Ukrainians have been pushed back around Vasily a fair bit, so that could be a welcome gain, but could well just be a rejig as well. And then we come over to the north of Bakhmut, up through down through the highway into the north of Bakhmut. There's been some activity near Orikova-Vasilivka, and Deep State map, yellow line here, indicating that the Ukrainians have made some gains in this hilly area there, or where you've got sort of small river valleys and whatnot that I showed you yesterday, topographically speaking. And then we have, it's not shown on the map, but Syriac maps here saying, on my map, situation north of Bakhmut, recent video footage shows that the Russian army shelling Ukrainian positions in the small settlement of Crimea, which indicates Ukrainian troops have managed to re-enter in the locality for the first time since it was vacated last May. So that is, or I suppose not last May, but this May, the May just gone. So this is a significant gain for the Ukrainians, as according to Syriac maps there. In this area, in the north of Bakhmut, you've got Rosalie and the Omega Hotel along there, Omega Mini Hotel there. So in that general area there, that could well be an important gain. I was talking about how the Ukrainians had struggled somewhat in the Bakhmut area up here, and have been pushed back after getting into Bakhmut. And I think they may be looking for other places that were somewhat weaker for them to exploit, and maybe Crimea was one of those. But of course, as soon as you get further than that, you're getting right into the town, and I don't know that the Ukrainians really want to be going through the attritional, street-to-street fighting. Although there are some claims that actually greater attrition takes place out in these sort of trench lines and with activity like we've seen around Klishchiivka and whatnot. So intuitively you think it's far more difficult to fight street to street and you lose a lot more, but actually, these pretty much attritional everywhere, I guess. Right, let's see what the ISW has to say. Former Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar stated that Ukrainian forces recaptured 5.1 square kilometers of territory in Bakhmut direction in the past week. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces continued assault operations near Klishchiivka. Yevlash has stated that Ukrainian forces continue efforts to consolidate positions in Klishchiivka and that fighting continues near the railway line east of the settlement. Russian mail bloggers continue to claim that Ukrainian forces do not completely control Klishchiivka, claiming instead that the northern part of the settlement remains a contested grey zone after Russian forces withdrew from the settlement. Russian mill bloggers claimed, there could be, there are some claims that the Russians might be holding on to the odd house at the very top of Klishchiivka, but I don't know functionally whether that's meaningful or not. Russian mill bloggers claim that heavy fighting is ongoing along the Kurdyivka and Drivka-Klishchiivka line in nearby forest areas and near the railway line to the east. Otherwise, repelled attacks in a number of places, both to the north of Bakhmut and elsewhere. So Deep State here showing that the Ukrainians have made minor gains or gains around Klishchiivka, but that kind of falls in line with what other mappers had said previously. So again, it's not necessarily showing that the last 24 hours have seen the Ukrainians push forward, as the yellow line there is broadly either in line with Andrew Perpetua or behind it in places, or behind Surek maps in others. So anyway, activity around Kurdyivka, it'd be interesting to see what the Ukrainians do there. It's going to be increasingly more difficult for the Russians to hold on to Kurdyivka, given that the lines are collapsing to the northeast there along the railway line. Right, moving on down to Avdiivka, and again a day of not a lot to report from Avdiivka. Repelled attacks, as you can see from the ISW, ongoing fighting near Opitny and so on and so forth, but nothing really to report. And actually, nothing to report around Velika Novosilka, this salient here, where there's been such a lot of fighting. There was such a lot of fighting until the Ukrainians kind of stopped, went for a rotation and a refit, and they haven't really done much else around there other than probing attacks into Novoriivka and a few probing attacks around Priutne, where there's a bit of push and shove with the Russians there, and territory lost, territory gained, sort of a bit of back and forth. But anyway, we'll come around to Robotyne again, where there seems to be more activity there. As you can see, Surek maps showing that the Ukrainians are pushed on there. Andrew Perpetua showing that Ukrainians are pushed on to the south. Deep State map doesn't show any changes here. And Solid Foe Life, a Russian troll, and he's not American, he's a troll, on my threads says, Deep State map doesn't show any gains. What are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, Deep State map, as they admit, there's a really good documentary. I think you can see it in my playlist. If you click on the playlist below and go to Ukraine recommended videos, there's one on how they put their maps together. And they are beholden to the Russian MOD. When the Russian MOD say, I don't want you to say this, they won't say it. And in the counteroffensive, at times, they've had a 2 to 3 day delay on what they state. People like Surek Maps and Andrew Perpetua are not beholden to that. Surek Maps kind of might be to the Russian MOD, but Andrew Perpetua just posts what he sees and changes things in line with shelling analyses. Sometimes he doesn't talk about sources or things he's seen. He does make some judgment calls, but essentially I'm saying that if you don't see Deep State map lines move, it doesn't mean that something hasn't happened for sure. I mean, big time for them. I was saying when there were the counterattacks around Bakhmut, they had a pretty strict, at begin with at least, a pretty strict 48 to 72 hour delay on their claims. Right, anyway, let's go and look to see what is happening around here. So we have the situation at Zaporizhzhia front. Ukrainian army has restarted its advances along the first Russian main defense line, reaching the nearby outskirts of the town, where the Russian army has managed to repel the attack. So this is around Robotyne, the manned trench lines here. The Ukrainians having some joy moving both along them and down them, and that is, I think, pretty important move there for the Ukrainians' gain. Although it might not seem like it's a huge amount of gain, these are grinding and difficult maneuvers for the Ukrainians, and I think that is significant that they are indeed moving along that line. If we go to Andrew Perpetua's mapping, we can look here to see that it pretty much looks like what Surya Maps was stating there, and there's lots of satellite imagery to suggest shelling and Russian drone attacks, which means the Ukrainians are there, and then counterattacks from Ukrainians, satellite imagery showing a lot of shelling of trench lines, which generally means if the shelling is very heavy, then it usually means it's the Russians that have been doing that. Ukrainians have a lot more moderate shelling, so on and so forth. And you can see that this is where it's all happening, the Robotina area, as far as needing to break this larger trench line. And they are getting closer to that, actually, coming down south by to the east of Novorifiivka, where there is higher ground here. I don't know, I can tell on this map the height of the ground. I probably can if I tried. But if we go back to my map, that's in this area, some Ukrainian gains there. If you look at the bottom of my map, there's the height counter. So here we have some high ground. There is a 166 hill that's 166 meters. It's going to be somewhere around here that the Ukrainians are trying to take, move to the high ground. I don't know if you can notice it particularly from my topographical 3D approach. It's quite difficult without being able to accentuate on a browser version of this the height. You can accentuate it on other forms of this program like a 300% height, but here you can't. But you can see that it's a bit lower there. It's undulating in this area, and there's a hill that they do want to take, but I don't think they've taken it yet. There's talk about it sort of most weeks, but they're definitely moving to the south there and having some joy in that direction. And that, if they're able to break the trench line here, then that means that they have done so in two different places, breached that defensive line, and they can consolidate this whole area by moving up and down the trenches and to some degree sew it up. And the question is, where do they go from there? As you can see, it's just massively defended, but then the argument is that it's less densely mined and less manned. I mean, the Russians have concentrated much more. They put 60% of their efforts in making these trenches at the front, and less, 20% and 20% effort into the trenches behind. So it could be that we see a pickup in momentum for the Ukrainians. That's looking at it from a very positive point of view. Here the source says Ukrainian infantry coming under ATGM and artillery fire in the trench lines at this geolocation. We'll plug that in, which is to say they are right here, right on the Russian line. So I'd say Suryat map is incorrect there. The Ukrainians are there, and they're being sent ATGM presence by the Russians. I doubt that's the Russian defensive line, and Andrew Perpetua is probably somewhat more accurate in his claims here. And as you can see around Novorifiivka, the Russian line, as per Suryat maps, is much further in front of the other two mappers' lines here. So I think Suryat maps is being pretty generous to the Russians in this sector. Right, moving on, Poulet Volant shows the situation like this. The Russians are counterattacking in places, but as you can see, the Ukrainians are pushing all over this front line. There appears to be quite a lot of activity going on there. So that's Zaporizhzhia at the moment. Not too much more to say. I did forget to say a couple of things, as I keep doing. Going back to Opitny, they're using incendiary munitions, the Russians, on Opitny or in the surrounding areas, possibly on the trench lines to the north. Still not exactly sure who controls what in that area. Generally, the mappers agree, although for me, it's whether the Ukrainians are at all in the northern part of Opitny or not. Deep State map has the Russian defensive line slightly further back, or certainly be grey zone there. But anyway, incendiary munitions used there. And just some claims that I shared with you earlier, talking about back in Bakhmut, how the Ukrainians are using far more ammunition than the Russians, that they have more accurate and relentless artillery, and that we've also heard from other sources that their drone uses, and it also talks about drones here, that the Russians are lacking drones. They lack the ability to see at night, whereas Ukrainians do an awful lot at night. So on and so forth. The precision artillery allows the Ukrainians to be 50 meters away from the Russians and still use their artillery, rather than being 150 meters away, as was previously the case. So lots of advantages being eked out by the Ukrainians here. They build very quickly at night. If they take over a place, they get concrete in and sort of build up the shelter and dugouts really quickly. From scratch, a full-fledged covered dugout or a shelter for the foundation of a house. They entrench quickly, so on and so forth. So really positive outlook for the Ukrainians there, or appreciation of what the Ukrainians are doing. That's coming from a Russian propagandist. Take a bit more note when a Russian says that of the Ukrainian situation. But in the Bakhmut area, General Sursky said that there has been a breach. The Ukrainians have had a breakthrough there, but at the same time has also said that fierce battles are underway and the Russians are conducting multiple counterattacks from various directions, trying to regain lost positions following the loss of places like Andriivka and Novorifiivka. So it's still going to be tough for the Ukrainians there, but they do have the momentum, the wind in their sails, and they do seem to have some advantages there in terms of artillery, drones, tech, and just the way that they are working really across the board. Okay, when we come down to Dnipro, River Dnipro and the area, UK intelligence has said that both sides have launched raids with teams and small boats against the islands and against the opposite riverbanks. There is a realistic possibility that Russian operations in the area have been energized since the sector came under the responsibility of the newly created 40th Army Corps. We have seen claims on a daily basis of destroyed boats in the Dnipro River Delta, up and down the river. The Russians claim to take out a certain amount of Ukrainian boats, and the Ukrainians claiming to take out lots of Russian boats. 6 and 1, half a dozen the other, I guess. The only thing I would say is that we've come to take the Ukrainian claims a little more seriously than some of the Russian MD claims. The Russians are still targeting Ukrainian forces with FAB 500 bombs around the Antonivsky Bridge area here. We know that the Ukrainians had gained, or we don't know, there were claims that they gained a foothold along the river slightly further downstream, but also a little bit further upstream too. So those positions, we haven't heard a lot since then. We don't know anything about whether they still have any kind of foothold in the Aleshki area and the Kazachi Lahiri area, in other places, but they're still definitely operational around the Antonivsky Bridge, and that's for sure. And then the last thing really to say, if we go back to the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, just a few bits and pieces I forgot to say earlier, but I don't think it adds too much here. That the 5.2 square kilometers has been liberated within the past week in the Robotyne area, so they are still making consistent progress, even if it is fairly slow. A Russian mail blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces tried to land in occupied Crimea and simultaneously conducted a drone strike on the peninsula on September the 17th. That's a couple of days ago. The mail blogger, I did report at the time, I think, that there were claims that the Russians had propelled an amphibious attack across the Black Sea. The Mill blogger claimed that Russian naval aviation stopped 14 Ukrainian boats heading towards Crimea from Vilkovo, Odessa Oblast, and damaged several of the vessels. It could well have happened. There are these 4 rigs that are out in the Black Sea that enable the Ukrainians to have some electronic warfare presence, probably radar presence, and also a stepping stone for getting troops from the mainland across to Crimea via the Black Sea. They could well have attacked and been repelled by Russian aviation. it wouldn't surprise me at all. Anyway, that is all for the front line. Not a crazy amount of information. Hope that was useful to you. Please like, subscribe, and share. In the meantime, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.